Right now, inside your veins, there is a fossil, not bone, not stone, blood. And if you carry type O, that fossil is older than agriculture, older than cities, older than almost every story humans have ever told about themselves. Somewhere on a windswept plateau in what is now Iran, 60,000 years ago, a group of humans got stuck, not by choice, by geography. And for 15,000 years, they went nowhere. What happened to them during that stretch of silence rewrote the biology of nearly every person alive outside Africa today. It rewrote yours if you are watching this. Hit subscribe. Every week, we dig up another buried piece of ancient history and bring it straight to you. You already know your blood type. Maybe a nurse mentioned it before a surgery. Maybe a DNA kit told you. And if you happen to be O positive or O negative, you have probably heard the folklore that comes attached to it. That it is the universal donor. That it is the original blood type. That it somehow ties you to some ancient, almost mythical branch of humanity. Here is the twist. Some of that folklore is actually true, and the real explanation behind it is stranger, older, and far more interesting than anything the myths came up with. Because your blood type was never just a medical label sitting on a hospital chart. It is a message written into your DNA by your ancestors, whether they meant to leave it or not. It tells you where they walked, what diseases nearly wiped them out, which migrations they survived, and which ones they didn't. And in 2025, a study landed that finally connected the dots, tracing the birth of human blood types, especially type O, back to one specific place and one specific moment in the human story. That story involves a lost plateau, a 15,000-year pause nobody expected, and what scientists are now calling a genetic incubator, a biological pressure cooker that quietly reshaped the blood of almost every human being who isn't of African descent. Before we go further, let's clear something up, because most people only know half the picture. Blood type is not some vague, mystical trait. It comes down to actual proteins, called antigens, sitting on the surface of your red blood cells. Type A blood carries A antigens. Type B carries B antigens. Type AB carries both. And type O carries neither. Sit with that for a second, because it matters. Type O isn't defined by what it has. It's defined by what it doesn't have. At a molecular level, it is the blank slate, the baseline humans started with before anything changed. Type A and Type B came later, born from mutations that added the machinery to build those extra antigens. Type O is not a variation, it's the original. Then there's the arch factor, the plus or minus sign after your letter, and that's a completely separate system, controlled by a different gene entirely. Rh positive means you're carrying a protein called RhD. RhNegative means you're not. Around 85% of humans on this planet are Rh positive, and Rh negative shows up far more often in people of European descent, which, as we'll get to, is not a random coincidence either. Put your letter and your Rh sign together, and you get your full blood type. O positive turns out to be the most common combination almost everywhere on Earth. O negative, the rarer cousin, is the one hospitals fight to keep stocked, because it can be given to nearly anyone in an emergency. It is, quite literally, universal. But none of that explains where these variants actually came from. Why does type O dominate entire populations in some corners of the world, while barely showing up in others? That's where the 2025 study comes in. A research team out of France's National Center for Scientific Research went digging, not through modern blood samples, but through ancient DNA, pulled from hundreds of individuals scattered across Eurasia, spanning thousands upon thousands of years. And what they found broke the old assumptions wide open. Blood type didn't just exist and stay frozen while humans wandered out of Africa. It evolved along the way. New variants appeared at very specific moments, and when researchers mapped the timing of those changes, they lined up almost perfectly with the major stalls and bottlenecks in the human migration story. Not roughly, precisely. And the biggest, most dramatic stall of all happened on the Iranian Plateau. Here's the part most people never learned in school. When modern humans left Africa, they didn't sweep across the planet in one smooth wave. Large groups got stuck in specific pockets of land, sometimes for thousands of years, before ever moving on. The Iranian Plateau was one of the most important of those pockets. And according to this new evidence, humans sat there, essentially paused, for around 15,000 years. During that stretch, something quietly happened inside their bodies. The modern versions of type O, A, and B blood didn't just appear, they stabilized, locked in. The population was large enough to hold on to genetic diversity, but isolated enough that new variants could actually take hold and stick around instead of getting diluted or lost. So when these groups finally packed up and pushed further into Eurasia, they carried those blood type variants with them, seeded into every population that came after. Which means if you have type O blood today, that exact molecular signature can be traced back to people standing on a plateau in Iran 60,000 years ago, going nowhere. In a very real sense, your blood remembers that pause, even if you never will. Now look at how blood type is scattered across the modern world, and one pattern jumps out immediately. Type O isn't spread evenly. In some populations, it's everywhere. In others, it barely registers. Take indigenous communities in South and Central America. In some groups, type O frequency comes close to 100%. That is not chance. That is the fingerprint of a population bottleneck, combined with brutal disease selection, working in the background for thousands of years. Roughly 15,000 years ago, the ancestors of indigenous Americans crossed over from northeastern Asia across the Bering Land Bridge. That crossing squeezed the population down to a small founding group, and by pure luck of the draw, that group happened to carry very high frequencies of type O. Once they were established in the Americas, cut off from the disease environments back in Eurasia and Africa, that type O dominance didn't fade, it intensified. You can actually see the fingerprint of that bottleneck today. Type B is almost completely absent in pre-contact indigenous American population, and that absence is one of the clearest signals scientists have that the founding group was small and stayed isolated for thousands of years before Europeans ever arrived. Compare that to Central and South Asia, where blood type distribution looks far more balanced. A genetic record of centuries of different populations mixing, colliding, and blending together. West African populations show heavy type O presence too, but alongside meaningful type A, pointing to a very different evolutionary path. East Asian populations tend to lean toward higher type B, shaped by their own specific migrations and disease pressures stretching back 20,000 years. In other words, blood type frequency is a map, a population-level record of who moved where, who got trapped, and who survived what, which raises the obvious question. If type O is the original, the ancestral form, and still the most common blood type on Earth, why did A and B ever bother evolving at all? The answer is disease, one of the most brutal forces shaping human evolution. Different blood types carry different levels of vulnerability to different pathogens, and this isn't some minor footnote. People with type O are noticeably more vulnerable to cholera. The bacteria that causes it actually exploits the blood type antigen system to invade intestinal cells, and in regions with a long history of cholera outbreaks, especially South and Southeast Asia, that vulnerability would have been a real brutal disadvantage. Type A carries its own curse. People with type A blood appear more vulnerable to smallpox. When smallpox tore through Europe and later the Americas, it hit populations with higher type A frequencies especially hard. And type O comes with yet another weak spot, the plague, the same disease that wiped out roughly a third of Europe's population in the 14th century. Populations carrying more type A and type B blood came through those plague years at slightly higher survival rates than populations dominated by type O. This is exactly why evolution never let one blood type simply take over. Depending on which disease was sweeping through at the time, a different blood type held the advantage. The map of blood types we see scattered across the globe today is really just the accumulated scar tissue of which diseases hit which populations the hardest, and when. Now, out of every pattern in this story, one might be the strangest of all: the distribution of RhNegative blood. Around 15% of people with European ancestry are RhNegative. Among people of sub-Saharan African ancestry, that number drops to somewhere between 3 and 8%. Among East Asian populations, it's under 1%. And in some indigenous American groups, RhNegative is almost non-existent. That kind of concentration has fueled decades of speculation, most of it far outside the boundaries of actual science. People have pointed to Basque origins, Neanderthal ancestry even, unbelievably, alien intervention. Most of that can be thrown out immediately. But the Basque question itself is worth asking honestly, because RhNegative frequency among the Basque people climbs as high as 30%. The most credible explanation combines founder effect with genetic drift among early European populations. The Basque carry unusually high levels of ancestry from Europe's earliest hunter-gatherers. The people who lived across Western Europe long before farming ever arrived. Their elevated RhNegative frequency is very likely a direct echo of that ancient population, a signature that got diluted elsewhere as farming groups and later migrations swept in and mixed everything together. In the Basque bloodline, that old signal never fully disappeared. It survived because their isolation, geographic and cultural, held on just long enough to protect it. It is quite literally a biological memory of the people who once hunted mammoths across pre-farming Europe. Now, before this starts sounding like it explains everything about who you are, here's the honest caveat, and it matters. Your blood type comes down to essentially one gene, plus the separate Rh gene sitting next to it. That is an almost microscopic sliver of your genome, which contains roughly 20,000 genes in total. Trying to read your entire ancestry off your blood type is like trying to judge an entire painting by staring at 2 pixels. Blood type will not tell you your ethnic background. It will not tell you whether you carry Neanderthal DNA. It will absolutely not tell you anything about your personality or your intelligence, no matter what internet quizzes and outdated pop psychology claim. That is folklore, not science. What your blood type actually gives you is a single thread pulled from a much bigger tapestry, one woven from migration, isolation, and disease. Type O, the ancestral form, still traces back to a group of humans paused on the Iranian Plateau 60,000 years ago. It dominates indigenous American populations because of a founding bottleneck 15,000 years old. It leaves you more exposed to cholera, yet historically more resistant to smallpox than Type A ever was. Your blood type is not a horoscope, and it is not your destiny. It is a record, quietly carried in every single drop running through your body, waiting for someone curious enough to actually read it. If you're finding this kind of thing fascinating, hit subscribe. I cover groundbreaking science discoveries like this every single week.